Good. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the introduction. It's my first time I am in a microfinance conference, and I'm delighted to be here, to be exchanging views with all of you. And I'm going to try to link the microfinance to the macro events that are happening right now, and especially why are we losing economic potential, why are we losing talent, why are we wasting the resources that are latent but are underused, because very often they don't have the opportunities and they don't have the finance to actually thrive. I'm going to be talking about what are increasingly known as development traps in a world in transition. And you're going to mainly ask, what is this of a development trap? But I'm going to put the main argument with you. And the main argument is that many places where we live are not thriving. They're not doing as well as they should do, and they're playing below their capacity. Whether they are in lagging behind regions in the US, or in lagging behind regions in Europe, or declining regions, where they are in many transition countries, or in Central Asia, or in parts of the developing world, what we have is that increasingly economic activity is becoming concentrated, and is becoming concentrated in very few places. Normally the macro cities, the capitals, the most dynamic areas, whereas not just small, remote, rural villages and towns, but intermediate cities, and very often relatively large cities, are experiencing low economic growth, low employment generation, and low productivity growth. And these traps, as I said, are not just concentrated in one part of the world, they're spread out, and they are creating problems. Economic problems because we have foregone potential, but also they're leading to political problems, which is reactions, crisis, leading to a more turbulent and challenging world, as we were seeing, and it's also leading, in the end, when you have political turmoil, to lower well-being, lower opportunities, and lower economic dynamism. But first you're going to ask, what is this of a development trap? And this is where you should come and stay with me. It's a concept that I have developed with colleagues, Simone Marino and Michael Stolper, that comes from what is known as the middle income trap. The middle income trap developed by the World Bank and then McGill and Karras in the 2000s, which mainly, it was a theory that looked at countries and said, well, we have a lot of countries growing, but when they reach a level of development of around $11,000, some other people say $15,000, they become stuck and they don't grow. This becomes easier to understand with an example. The key example is in the 1960s, South Korea and Brazil were growing at the same rate and had the same level of development. Since the 1960s, Brazil has been more or less stuck, growing very little, whereas South Korea has shot up to the ranks of the most dynamic regions. And what we did was translate this concept and adapt it from countries to regions across the world. Not just for poor regions that grow and are stuck, but we actually looked and saw that many areas, rich, poor, and of intermediate development, were not growing at the same rate as others. That some were losing out in terms of income, in terms of productivity, and in terms of employment. So we decided to put all this together and measure it relative to a place's own past. So are you growing in these three dimensions more or less than you were in the past, relative to the rest of the country the region is in, and then also relative in the case of the European Union, but also in other places, in this case, to the whole of the European Union, so the wider economic space in which a region is located. And this is graphically what it looks like. So you might be growing for a long time above the historical baseline of your own region in the past, of the country you're in, or the super region in which you are, and then after a certain point, you start falling behind. And in some cases, this is a temporary blip, but in many cases, it becomes some sort of structural background, and it does last for a long time. So we put all this together, we created several indices, And we measure 3 dimensions. The first one is the risk. Is your city, is your region, is the place where you live, where you actually provide your activities in a development trap, at risk of falling in a development trap? If it is, how big is the trap relative to other places? And as importantly, because when traps are durable, then it becomes a problem. How long have you been in a trap, and what are the consequences of being in a trap? And more than the abstract, what you want to see is how this translates into a concrete measurements. And you have them here. Let's take a look at, this is the measurement of the trap, looking at the average trap in the case of Europe. Anything that is the risk of being in a trap. Anything that is in dark red means a high level of a trap. Anything that is in very light pinkish color means a low level of a trap. And then what I want to look at is to look at the region, if I can get it here, it's the region of Paris. The city of Paris itself is not in a trap. It's actually very light pink, but it is surrounded by a sea of dark red, a lot of regions. And it's not just exclusively one thing that you can see in the case of France, it extends to Italy, to Croatia, to places like Romania, to places like Greece, and I would say that many of the regions in this area of the world would also be in a development trap. When we look at intensity, we find a different map. So you might be in a low intensity trap in some parts of France, but the intensity becomes much bigger. That means that the loss of employment opportunities, of growth in productivity and income is far greater in many parts of central and northern Italy, but also in the inland parts of Croatia. You said that Bosnia had the biggest delegation here. So the area on the border with Bosnia in Croatia actually has the highest level of intensity of the trap. And then you can see also in parts of Greece. But it also happens in very dynamic countries. You have here Ireland, if I can put it over there, and then in Ireland you can see a blot of dark blue, which is high intensity of trap in the Midland regions. Why? Because growth is being concentrated in Dublin and in Cork, and many of the other areas are not sharing the benefits and the well-being that emerges from economic dynamism. And then finally, we look in Europe at the duration of the trap. And here in Europe, what is something that I find very interesting is that the trap has become a structural problem. You're not in a trap for a year and you come out. You're not in a trap for 5 years. This is the period between 2001 and 2019, a maximum of 19 years. And anything that is dark red means that you have been in the trap a minimum of 17 years. 17 years, almost the whole period. And now remember this relative to the risk, and remember, because I'm going to come back to what the consequences are. Whereas Paris is thriving, the surrounding areas around Paris are actually stuck. And they have been stuck now for a generation, going nowhere. And it's not just there, you can find them in Italy, in many parts of Spain. You can find it in places that in theory should be dynamic, like Lisbon in Portugal, which has been stuck for quite some time, and you have much less of that evidence in many parts of Central and Eastern Europe, with the exception, for example, of Croatia, parts of Romania, and of course, Greece here. But is this something that is confined to Europe? No. I'm going to highlight that there are other parts of the world, like the United States or Central Asia, where I'll bring an example, that have also significant problems with that development trap. Let me start with the United States. It's the same, but we have differences. In the United States, we have a longer time horizon. We look at traps since the 1970s, and what we find is that yes, there are a lot of regions in the Rust Belt of the United States, in Appalachia, but also on the inland of coastal states on the Pacific coast, inland California, inland Oregon, inland Washington, that are stuck in a trap. But there, the difference is that it's not a permanent state, it's not structural, you have much greater volatility. Many cities, many regions, many places go in a trap, and then come out, and then sometimes they start recovery, but very often they fall again in the trap, which is difficult from what we find in Europe, in which the trap has become structural. You have a map. Anything that is in red, it means a higher level of entrapment. And as I was saying, you can find it in places like Pennsylvania, upstate New York, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana. You can find it in the area of the Appalachian Mountains, in Kentucky, in North Carolina, in Georgia. But you can also find it outside the coast in the whole of the West Coast. So, and the fact is that income is not no shield. You can be in a trap, like you were in parts of Ireland, at very high levels of income. It's not just affecting poorer places. And you can have different locations, so you can be in green, not at risk of a trap, but then you have very distressed areas, including cities like Buffalo, or, for example, places like Cleveland in Ohio. And when you put this in an example, more than in abstract graphs, etc., you find the situation Detroit is in. Not that long ago, so I was already born in that period, in 1970, Detroit was the 4th largest city in the United States. It hasn't grown. It was a city known for Motown, so motor cars and music. Now the city has been declining for a long time, and that decline has not just been translated in loss of jobs, loss of opportunity, loss of economic dynamism, but also loss of population. It has gone down from being the 4th richest city, the 4th most populous city in the United States, to being the 26th city today. And despite some signs of new dynamism, the city is still not doing very, very well. But also, I'm going to bring and highlight where this happens in places where I have had significant amount of work in recent years, which is the case of Kazakhstan. And I don't know whether there's anyone from Kazakhstan, but in Kazakhstan I remember I was called through the Asian Development Bank by the government to actually help them measure the internal disparities within Kazakhstan. Why? Because Kazakhstan has been a country that has done, over the last few decades since independence, very well. It has grown much faster than most countries in the world, with very few exceptions like Ireland or China. But Kazakhstan was poor in 1991, but everyone was equally poor. In recent years, Kazakhstan has grown, but wealth has concentrated in very few places of the country. And when I did the first report, I measured inequality, I measured trajectories, I measured competitiveness, and then, since I was doing the development trap, I measured the development trap. And when it was given, the report, it was given to the minister went through all the maps and then stopped at this map and said, what is this? That was in 2021. And this is a map of the development trap in Kazakhstan. Anything that is in dark blue means that you're trapped, that you're growing below what you were doing in the past and below the rest of Kazakhstan in terms of employment, GDP, and productivity. And then you have some relatively poor, albeit in some cases densely populated regions, like, let me see if it works now. No, sorry. Yeah, over here. So I have to put it over there, and it won't work. All right, so you have over here, oh, it doesn't work. Anyway, right over here, the city of Shymkent and the Oblast of Turkestan, which are highly densely populated, but relatively poor, unstuck, not doing very well. You also have Kyzyllurda, whereas you have Baikonur, which is low density, also not doing very well. But also on the west, you have Mangistau, which is one of the main oil-producing oblasts in the country, in theory rich, but the population is not benefiting from this, and it's also a place that has been stagnant for quite some time. But it's not just Mangistau, it's also the whole west oil rich producing in places like Atirau and West Kazakhstan. And when you move all this, you have that situation, and I'm going to bring the consequences in a moment, but you have that sort of problem elsewhere. So in Europe, what we have is a problem of low stagnant growth, and it affects high income, medium income, and to a much lesser extent low income regions. In the whole case of Kazakhstan, it affects high and low level income regions. And in the case of the United States, the main difference is that it's highly volatile. Whereas in Kazakhstan or in Europe, they get stuck. In the United States, you go into a trap, you come out, and sometimes you go back, or sometimes you thrive afterwards. So now that we have what it is and we have measured what it is, what are the consequences? And there are two important consequences. There are economic consequences, and there are also political consequences, and how they feed on each other. The first one is the economic price of territorial myopia, if you want. Why is being in a trap a big problem? Because first you waste talent. And this is where microfinance comes in, and it's important. Talent is distributed more or less evenly across places. Opportunities are not. And a mainstream economist would tell you, you go to the opportunities. So if you happen to be from a remote area of Albania, on the border with North Macedonia, with Kosovo, the answer to you would be, there's no future here, go, get on your bike and move to where you have opportunity. An opportunity might not even be in Tirana. Move to London, move to Munich. But they have realized that this is not working. So the second option is, let's subsidize. But when you subsidize people, what you're doing is all their talent, all their potential is wasted. Here, the whole idea is that we are not actually investing enough in places that have got a wealth of talent, and in some cases where motors that are going to develop relatively recently, and we're channeling more and more investment to places that are already dynamic, and that in the long run is undermining the potential of many places in Europe, elsewhere in the world, that have got significant potential and it's been wasted. That has difficulties, because let's suppose that we follow what is being proposed now for Europe. Let's start to imitate what China and the United States is doing. But if we want to develop a massive AI, and this is what's on the table right now, you cannot do it everywhere. You have to bet on one place, and even if you're successful, which is highly doubtful, that place is not going to be Tirana, it's not going to be Albania, it's not going to be virtually anywhere, it's going to be probably Paris or Munich. Those are the only places where we have significant potential. Does that mean that the other places do not have potential? They have massive potential, but we need to do other things in those places. And that would be an opportunity cost. And then the cost of ignoring this is that you might not be mobilizing that potential, you might not be tapping on the talent that you have locally, and you would allow this drift of population to continue. And as a whole, as an aggregate, whether you are Albania or you're Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan or you are Thailand, you will be losing out in the medium and long run because you're not flying your airplane with all four motors. You're trying to fly your airplane with just one motor, and if that motor fails, the whole country falls. So my advice would be, well, use your talent. Second, and this is one thing that we're seeing in the case of Europe. In the case of Europe, yes, some places are dynamic, but we have 60 million people today living in places that have a lower GDP per capita than they had in the year 2000. 135 million, or 1/3 of the population of the European Union, living in places that have barely grown. Growth has been below 0.5% per capita per annum. So these are places that have been drifting away since the millennium and have fallen behind. And are these places where you should invest? No, these are places that until very, very recently were among the most dynamic places in Europe. I'm thinking about the Italian industrial districts that until the 1980s were the hub of the Italian economic miracle. And so you have this foregone potential, but you also have foregone choke points. We're talking about geopolitics, and geopolitics is about what do you have that the others don't have. If we try to actually pursue the shadows of the Americans and the Chinese in the case of Europe, then what's going to happen? We're never going to be leaders, we're never going to have choke points. If we build on what we have, and that's where funding and microfinance you might end up with a lot of the reinforcing the areas in where Europe is still leader, and there are quite a few areas that I can talk later, but also you can actually encourage the development of other activities where we have significant potential, but that potential is underused because sometimes it's not in the usual places. And remember, much of the European dynamism in recent years has not come from Paris and Munich, it has come from places that in many ways were considered not to be auspicious for economic development. But on top of that, there's an important political price, which is, in my view, as important. And this pans out in very different ways in different parts of the world. In the case of Europe, it has led to a rise of Euroscepticism, anti-system voting, and populism. When you're in a trap for a long time, you think that you end up with no solutions, so you vote against the system that hasn't delivered for you. And this is the rise of anti-system voting. You can see this is until the year 2022. In national elections, that was anti-system vote, Eurosceptic vote in the case of Europe was at 28.5% then. Last year, in 2025, it rose already to 33% of all the votes. And look at where it is concentrated. Remember my map of France? Look at France there. Sorry. Oh, if it just reappears, it went before, but yeah. There it is. You can see Paris voting for mainstream parties surrounded in a sea of red voting for Eurosceptic parties. But it's also, look at Italy, look at East Germany, look at Poland, look at Hungary. You have all this spread throughout. In other cases, what is translated in other ways. So yes, we all want to be like the United States, and we envy the macro aggregate growth of the United States. But the Americans are saying, we don't want this United States. So what is that? Because they're voting for an anti-system president. And where is that happening? Fundamentally in these places that are happening in the trap. Yes, because the country is doing very well, but the wealth is concentrated in few places and in the hands of the very few. Whereas if you are in West Virginia, you're in Ohio, you are in Iowa, you are in Indiana, you're doing far worse than you were doing before. And that is a price that they are paying. But also, you have it in the case of Kazakhstan. I remember I gave my development track plan to the minister in October 2021, and then at the beginning of 2022, there was a hike in the liquefied gas prices, and the country erupted. Where did it erupt? Precisely in the places where you have a development track. It started in Janorjan, in Mangistau, and it spread to many of the southern parts where discontent was brewing because there were no opportunities in terms of employment and growth. So you can have different manifestations from Eurosceptic voting, although in Europe we have not been, especially the French or the Dutch, about revolts of those that are disadvantaged and living in disadvantaged places as a result of that, the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests. We might have a structural realignment in terms of what we see in the United States and much greater polarization within the country, and we might have open unrest as it happened on the 2nd of February 2022 in Kazakhstan. And this creates a toxic feedback loop. Places that are falling behind, they get into a development trap, voice their discontent, whether it is through revolt or at the ballot box. That leads to a much more fragile and difficult political situation. That fragile political situation feeds into the economy, and then the economy leads to lower economic growth. And I know it firsthand because I live in a country that suffered this. In the UK was doing very well, and it did very well since the single market for more than 30 years, but growth was concentrated in London. Yes, the macroeconomy was good, London, Oxford and Cambridge were thriving, but the rest of the country was losing employment, was losing hope, was losing opportunities, and talent was wasted. When they were given the opportunity to vote for Brexit, they decided to vote for Brexit, And now, the areas that were falling behind are doing worse, but they knew they were going to lose. The areas that were doing well, like London and me in London, are doing worse, but we never thought we were going to do worse, and the whole country is doing worse as a result. So how do we avoid this? How do we spring the trap? And there are things that shouldn't be done. We shouldn't do counter-cyclical transfers, which is something, you have a crisis and you put more money, so that leads to more debt later on. We shouldn't do subsidies, which is what is now saying, what do we do with these areas? Let's subsidize them, as I said before. We shouldn't go and try to imitate Silicon Valleys and try to create Silicon Valleys in the middle of Albania, because that rarely works. And we shouldn't do place line moonshots, the whole idea of saying, let's have a massive sort of big project that then turns into a white elephant. Money delivered matters much less than the institutional capacity that is other places receiving it. What doesn't work? Using what you're doing, funding, investment, strategies, to actually build on what you have and help the sort of people that you're helping, but not just at the level, the sort of firms that you're helping, but also at a much bigger scale, to not do exactly the same thing they're doing, but get funding, get support, get capacity to innovate, to actually move into sectors that are related, reinvent themselves, and become dynamic again. Digitalize. So let's stop chasing big dreams and try to digitalize and use AI, new technologies, automation, to make sure that we do what we do better, and in the process, we transform what we do into something new and far more sophisticated. That will allow to strengthen the real choke points. Yes, we can try to create an AI-generating industry in the whole of Europe, but why not invest in those areas where we have a more significant advantage? We are the best, by quite some margin, at producing the machines that lead to the production of chips that are at the base of AI. But we are leaders in many areas surrounding medicine, and we are leaders in not just high tech, but also medium tech sort of firms, in apparel, in flat furniture like with IKEA. So why not also, this is a way to actually generate new activity and facilitate the generation of innovation intermediaries. So this can be done in different ways. I'm going to focus mainly on the solutions in the case of Europe, and we can talk about other, especially in the chat, in other places. We might do things like, for example, improve the completion of the single market, address the bottlenecks and do reforms, which do not cost any money, but they cost political capital. Translate the knowledge. We in Europe are very good at producing knowledge, but it doesn't reach industry. So how do we know that the knowledge that has been produced in research centers and universities, sometimes in firms, is actually used to the best of our capacity? And also facilitate scaling up, and this is where you play a crucial role. How do you transform an idea and a project into something that is then becomes an enterprise, and that enterprise doesn't stay as a micro-enterprise but grows into a, let's say, a gazelle or a small and medium-sized enterprise? How do you go about doing this? And this is where we have to work. And you put this all together, and then you end up with a far more dynamic capacity to generate opportunities. But in order to do that, you need to also invest in institutions. Finance alone does not suffice. I think it was highlighted already by our sponsor, by the Vice President of the Bank of Albania, Vice Governor. We need to invest to fund, but we also need to invest in education, in training, and skills. We need to invest in developing the capacity to innovate. We need to invest in improving our institutions. And let me just say, what you're doing and is likely to work? What you're doing, I think, is absolutely fundamental in the current situation, because you're helping people, real people, wherever they live, play to the best hands they have. And when you multiply that, you end up that we can play with our cards. Of course, I would like to be Roger Federer, but I haven't got the talent. And if you wish and want to transform me and put a lot of money into making me Roger Federer, that's never going to work. But I know I can be a better researcher if I have the right support and the right amount of investment. And this is where you can make a difference. There's a widespread trap, and it's more or less the same trap everywhere. But if you play to your own hands, if you make sure that whatever talent that is untapped there is used, you can make sure that you're giving those firms, those people, an opportunity, and you can avoid the prices that we are paying at the moment. You can avoid the economic price of not using the talent that we have elsewhere, everywhere. You can avoid the political price of massive discontent triggering polarization and conflict within our societies, and you can avoid this negative feedback loop of one feeding the other. So what we need to do is to have policies that are, and interventions and strategies and funding that are adapted and play to the strengths of every place. This is what we call place-sensitive type of intervention. They have to be structural. I know that everywhere we like to respond to emergencies, but when the emergencies become daily situations, then the emergencies are only going to grow. You become strong by building, strengthening your pillars. And then you need to make sure that you're patient. This is not something that's going to happen overnight. The results take time, but if done in a good way, in a solid way, with societal consensus and developing the right institutions, they normally work, and they work to a much greater extent than pursuing pipe dreams. So if Europe, or if any of your countries, wherever you are bound to grow, my advice is try not to struggle at doing imitation. Try to succeed by being yourself, and not just by being yourself, by building on what you have and transforming yourselves and your firms and your companies into a better self. Thank you very much.
Thank you, professors. Thank you for staying with us on stage. We are
yes.
Yeah, please be seated.
Okay, thank you.
Feel yourself comfortable. We are moving now to our fireside chat, where we put all this into practice of microfinance sector. So let me welcome Kristina Maslauskaite, the senior economist at the Council of Europe Development Bank. I guess I don't really need to introduce you, Kristina, so immediately to your conversation. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for having us. And thank you, Andrés, for taking the time to come and meet the sector. I think it was quite an eye-opening lecture for all of us. My role today is to ask questions, which should come easy to me since I was your student 15 years ago. And I want to connect the title of our conference, the purpose of microfinance, to what you have walked us through in your lecture, and to see how very practically we can construct solutions that can address all these different problems that you have emphasized. So the diagnostic was quite rich, and I think we all understood where the problem lies. It was quite gloomy as well, to be honest. But in addition to that, in addition to all these structural issues, we have all these mega trends that are also shaping how the development pathways proceed. And just, to bring all of the debate a bit closer to the ground, this morning I had the privilege with FedInvest to visit a group of Albanian beekeepers who live in underserved rural areas, have difficulties to access markets, to sell their produce, But in addition to that, they are affected by geopolitics, by energy crisis, by all these things, as well as the climate change. As the climate is getting hotter here in Albania, the diseases are shifting, the calendars are changing, and so all these things, just add to their difficulties in moving, in living in these development traps. So in your view, how do these sort of micro enterprises, farmers, informal enterprises survive and live in these trapped regions? And what is the difference between being in a trapped region and being in a region that is better off?
Well, let me start by, I think you have two parts. Thank you very much for the question, Kristina. Two parts in the question that I think are relevant. The first one is, to what extent is microfinance these days relevant? And then the second part, which is, and does it work differently in different places depending on whether they are more or less dynamic, more or less trapped? Let me start by that. I know that microfinance has come under a lot of scrutiny in recent years because, if you give money to the people you went to see this morning, you get funding to beekeepers, and they manage to repay their loans later on, but then they ask for the same sort of loan the year after, and it goes year after year. Is that in the end just a process of inclusivity for people that are at the margins, or is it something better? My suggestion here is that this question should be addressed in a way that is, what is the alternative? Yes, it would be good if the beekeepers move up the production chain and do other things. But the alternative to not doing anything is that these people would not be able to pursue their dreams, would not be able to pursue their problems, would not be able to fight for their capacity, and they would end up in being subsidized in a sort of social policy, and there's nothing wrong with social policy, but without the capacity to actually try to deliver something. The good thing about microfinance, even if it doesn't lead to any sort of improvement, is that on the one hand, it does allow people to pursue their projects, to fight for the future, and it gives people a sense of purpose. It gives them the dignity of a job, which is something that you cannot achieve by just being subsidized and staying in your house in Leeds, staring at the wall. So in that situation, microfinance actually works. And on top, it produces a social policy, if it was to do that, that is far more efficient than a social policy that involves just subsidies. Because these are people, what is the rate of defaults of the microfinance activities that you find?
Depending where you look at. Could
But
be
on
anywhere
average.
from 1% to 15%.
But the average, 1% is...
In the region, it's very low, let's say, very low.
So, if they all repay their loans, it's the government that doesn't have to pay. They're paying themselves. But the thing is that this is not a social policy in any way. Many of these beekeepers would not just improve the quality of their honey, they would also make sure that the honey is produced more because they will have the training to avoid the illnesses that are related to bees. They might be able and be taught and pursue possibilities to commercialize well beyond the borders of Albania. They might diversify into related products, candles, wax, moving forward, beauty products, and they might grow into the next hub of beauty products related to bees in not just Albania or the southeast of Europe, but possibly in the world. Who knows? And we have seen it. And in that case, you're producing economic development. So in the worst case scenario, this is a win-win. In the best case scenario, it's a massive boost for economic development.
So this is a very positive message for all of us. And just to complement a bit your response, what we believe in, and Jaime is here to to confirm is that microfinance and microcredit is not the same as was mentioned by the Vice Governor. We want to complement microcredit with trainings, with business development services, with these activities to allow these people to progress further. And microfinance institutions, many of them are uniquely positioned to know the needs, the knowledge gaps, and to deliver them. And this is what we have witnessed today with the beekeepers in Albania. So indeed, this is an important message to pass to the sector.
This is related to your second question before, because do you operate in the same environments? Of course, it's much more difficult to operate in a place where you have a development trap and in a place that's thriving. Microfinance and microcredits can actually work very well without any sort of support in areas where you have the right institutions, the right training, the right skills, the right capacity to actually network. Mm-hmm. In other places, microfinance works much better when it's accompanied by other measures. Just giving a credit to a would-be entrepreneur that hasn't got the capacity to do any sort of accounting would not work if it doesn't come with the right training. Just giving someone access, for example, to an AI would not work if it doesn't come with some sort of minimal level of training to say, how can you make the best use of AI to transform your business? And that's where microfinance complements and becomes an essential tool for any sort of economic development and the development of new activities and making sure that new ideas and projects are actually delivered in reality.
Right, right. And it's interesting that you mentioned institutions, and a few years back we have done together some research on how institutional quality shapes the outcomes of levels of access to credit, basically, of these micro enterprises. Could you tell us a bit more about these findings and how this relates to your research on development traps?
Yes, I think it's important to highlight the role of institutions. Many places that fall into development traps is not because they don't have potential, but because that potential is actually in a situation that cannot be used because the institutional conditions are weak. And when I talk about institutions, it would be the formal institutions like the rule of law or, for example, the protection of private property, but it's also the informal institutions. The level of trust that you have in the system, the level of corruption that you have, whether you think that your decision makers are working for the common good or they're working for their own private interests, and that is something that in some cases can create significant barriers for economic development. So that's why financing is not the only solution. Financing is essential for economic development, but it needs to come hand in hand with other sorts of transformations. And improving the trust that your would-be entrepreneurs have in the system, that they will be supported, that there will be help in case of need, but that they can also have the environment in which they would be able to thrive, to develop their own ideas without significant burdens, significant problems, or perhaps the emergence of, let's say, organized criminality, as we see in some parts of the world. This is something that is going to encourage and is going to create economic development. And this is something that I'm really proud of, because the European Union, after much of the research that was done by others and myself, went with the cohesion policy, which is the largest policy in development policy in the world, since 2014 has introduced the idea of capacity building and institution building as an essential part of the policy.
Right. So if we linger on a bit more on this institutional capacity building, you have been advising lots of international organizations. You just mentioned the cohesion policy and all the work you have done there, but also governments, as you shared the example of Kazakhstan. Have you witnessed in the past decades of this work that the policymakers are actually taking these considerations into account? Is there progress? Are the institutions getting better?
Well, the more I work with policymakers around the world, the more I appreciate the role of policymakers. Policymakers, they represent, they got a mandate, they know what they're doing. Of course, you have, like in all walks of life, different types of policymakers, but most of them are genuinely interested in making and improving the quality of life of the citizens and finding the right solutions. So they listen. And very often they listen to what is being done. They have different advisors, they have different sources of information, and when they find that the solution can work, it can act. I'm going to give you two examples from outside Europe. I was involved now quite a few years ago in Colombia with the OECD, and in Colombia they had a massive problem in the level of taxation of natural resources and the problems of imbalances it was creating and the lack of opportunities for regions of Colombia with lack of natural resources. So what we proposed was a formula to actually use the benefits that we're generating from the levies on mining and oil production in a way that was more equally distributed across the country, and it not only led to a significant increase in economic activity, it also pacified problems of, on the one hand, too much corruption in areas that were awash with resources and relatively little corruption. And more recently, I've been working for quite a few years, as I mentioned, in Kazakhstan. The whole idea of now Kazakhstan is considering fiscal decentralization as a way to stimulate economic development, and especially to tap on the latent talent and potential that is across the whole of the country, which is not being used because most investment is stuck in both Astana and in Almaty, which are respectively the capital and the largest and most dynamic city.
Right, right. So I would like to touch upon two of the mega trends, and of course there are many of the things that are going on in the world and shaping our lives every day, but I think the trendiest topics are now AI and geopolitics, those that are the headlines of each newspaper. But before that, I would like to invite the audience to think about their questions. Once we're done with these two, maybe you could jump in and ask anything that sprung to mind while Andrés was presenting. So in terms of AI, Andrés, you have been doing research in the past year or two on the role of AI in regional development, and this is quite an innovative work. Could you share with us a bit of the conclusions, a bit of a sense of how AI will shape these places that are trapped? What are the opportunities that can be harnessed from these developments, and what are the main risks for the regions?
Well, AI has arrived, and now we all know what AI is, how it's transforming our daily lives, and it's here to stay. So we need to deal with it. It cannot be ignored. And I've been working into how does AI affect economic development and where do we benefit. But of course AI is many things. And you can be a generator of AI, you can generate new activities and new developments, or you can be an adopter of AI. And where are the generators? In very few places. There are very few people, and in very few places. AI at the level of the world is concentrated in, I would say, two places, which is the Silicon Valley or the San Francisco Bay Area, where you have OpenAI and Anthropic, and then it's in Hangzhou in China, where you have DeepSeek. And that's about it. These are the players.
Just to intervene, in your article you mentioned that only 2% of all AI patents are actually filed in Europe, 2%, so this was a shocking statistic.
Well, the shocking statistics is Europe, in terms of publications and research, does the same amount of research on AI as the United States.
Right.
But then it produces less than 4 patents per million inhabitants, in comparison to 160 in Korea and 47 in the United States. And then this represents 2% of all patenting in the world. So we are massively behind, not just Europe, but the rest of the world. And more importantly is where these patents, this generation is happening. Most of the biggest concentration is in the south of the Netherlands, in a place called Veldhoven, which is ASML. And even there is small, then it's Paris, and then it's Munich. I don't have the figures for Albania, but there's no patenting in Greece, there's no patenting in Bulgaria, there's no patenting In Romania, there's virtually no patenting. In the Baltic countries, there's virtually no patenting in the Nordics. So when you have that sort of situation, you have a dilemma. So you invest where? Yes, Europe needs that, but that means Paris is going to get all the benefits. And the rest of Europe is going to get nothing. But in Europe, like in China where I did the research, what you have is a lot of places are actually very good at adopting AI. And we have jumped from 8% of our firms using AI in 2023 to now 20% of European firms using AI in 2025. The calculation is that that's going to double by 2027. So in which we'll have almost 50% of the firms. And the good news is that the returns in terms of economic growth, productivity and innovation of adopting AI seem to be far greater across the board than generating AI. And where does that happen? Not necessarily at the top end, the innovators and the ones that are generating more employment, because their AI crowds out other sort of, but when it becomes complementary. In places like Albania, in places like the south of Spain, in places like Armenia or Georgia, they cannot aspire to be at the forefront of generating AI, but they can make a significant transformation by using AI.
And do you have disaggregated data? I wonder by the size of enterprise in terms of AI adoption. I would imagine that the micro enterprises would be less capable to adopt, or is it not necessarily the case?
They are less capable, but they are growing very fast. And one of the things is that they are teaching by preaching. The micro enterprises that are adopting AI seem to be the fastest growing right now.
Right.
So it's something that is going to be unavoidable.
So this is again the role where microfinance institutions can have. So again, we may come back to the trainings and all the advice that could be provided to the micro entrepreneurs. This is another way, I suppose, that you would be advising us to pursue.
I think it's a way that you need to go. It's an essential way. But as I said during my intervention, one thing is just giving funding to have access to AI, which, by the way, has a relatively low barrier to entry. And another thing is saying you get the funding, but on top of that, you get the right training, you get the right capacity, and you get the plan, or you help develop a plan that is adapted to your business so that your business can thrive. In those situations, the use of new technologies is going to help making your beekeepers not coming back next year to ask to give them exactly the same sort of microcredit they got this year. They will be coming back to ask you to give them a completely different microcredit to expand their business because they are now thriving.
Right. I'm wondering, Eva, how does it work for the questions? Oh, we have some questions.
Yes, okay. There are two questions.
Okay, so maybe let's take some questions from the audience before going to geopolitics. Could Andrés please elaborate on economic impact of loans for supporting families' education, health, and home improvement? So if we speak about non-business microcredit, but more about house improvements or consumption or health education and so on, because obviously microfinance is not only for business purposes, it could be for many other objectives.
Well, thank you very much for the question. Do you know who made the question?
Anonymous.
Anonymous, so fine. Thanks for the question. I'll skip the part on the housing because it's beyond my area of expertise, but I'm going to focus on the education and health, which are two fundamental determinants of economic development. Which are the societies that actually grow the most, that create more opportunities, are those that make the most of education and health. So getting a funding to make sure that people get the right training, get the right skills, get skills that very often are matched to their dreams and their projects, is going to allow opportunity to emerge, to be better identified and to thrive. The same happens with health. So yes, I think this is something that can be done, but it also needs to be followed up, because very often investment in health and education finds barriers that are beyond just the funding. So financing is important, but when you invest in, let's say, a lot of education but without the right institutions, then it might not lead to the best outcomes. What we're finding, and we have found for the last 4 decades, is that people in the south of Italy have got a higher level, on average, of education than the people in the north of Italy.
Right.
But the problem is that that talent and that capacity doesn't find any sort of outlet in the labour market, or doesn't find the opportunities to generate the sort of firms, because the institutional conditions are simply not there. In the centre and north of Italy, you might not have the same high level, although it's quite high, of education, but what you have is the opportunities to pursue your talent and to pursue your ideas, and also when you have a higher level of education, you have the right health, then you can actually develop more and create the sort of enterprises that will thrive and develop.
And the audience is asking, have you studied Norway in this, in terms of development traps, a country where oil has made everyone rich? What does it do to the country then?
Well, I happen to have a part-time chair in Norway, and I've done a lot of research on Norway. Yes, Norway has been made rich to a certain extent, and possibly to a large extent by oil, but it also made rich places like Qatar and the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, and despite huge reserves, it didn't make rich places like Venezuela, or it hasn't made rich places like Gabon or Equatorial Guinea or Nigeria. So yes, and the advantage of Norway is that because they have the strong institutions and they have used their resources through a national investment fund wisely, they have been able to put the seeds of support for a national strategy of development that involves a lot of other sectors at the high end of the technology, but also at the long end. Who would say that Norway is not just a world leader in areas like biotechnology more than nanotechnology, but also, which is a high-tech area, but also in areas like canning. So the production of fish and putting fish into a can. And there is an indication of a country that has known how to diversify, use existing talent, use education, and use the right amount of finance to mobilize all its potential, making sure that it's no longer dependent on oil, but it has a massive diversity of economic activity into that, to promote other sectors that have become dynamic. And one thing we have to remember, which I haven't said, Norway does not generate a lot of AI, since we were talking about that. But Norway is the leader in the whole of Europe in adoption of AI, and is among the leaders of the world, behind some countries in East Asia. And with that, it is still encouraging further to make sure that it's not just going to be dynamic, but it's going to remain dynamic even when the oil production is depleted.
Since you mentioned oil and the Middle East, what is the role of geopolitics and conflict that we are dealing with nowadays on a monthly basis, new crises erupting? What does it mean for the regions that are trapped and for the regions that are well off? Is there a difference, and what are the actual repercussions of that?
Well, the actual repercussions vary enormously. There are repercussions for the whole of Europe, but not all places are affected in the same way. When you are a dynamic area that has industries that export, that can compete in markets, they have got leverage. And even if there's like now, a hike in the price of oil, or there's a threat that they're going to be increasing tariffs, you can adapt and you can find new markets. If you have got a weak industrial base, you are less dynamic and you haven't got the skills, your firms are weak, you're going to suffer the consequences and you have no leverage. You have no capacity to actually fight. And then the entrapment becomes bigger. This is where the entrapment becomes not just a temporary situation like in many parts of the United States, but where it becomes chronic. Where your lack of dynamism, whether you are in northern France or in Wallonia, or you are in inland Croatia, or you're in some parts of Thrace in Greece, or you are in West Virginia, or you are in the northern highlands, mountains of Thailand, or in the central lowlands, this is where it becomes entrenched. And you're going to have much greater consequences. So that's why we cannot wait for places where they have latent potential, where the potential is untapped, for it to remain untapped. The earlier you invest, the earlier you design strategies, the earlier you encourage that talent to actually emerge, the less likely you're going to have problems in the future, and the more likely you're going to have a more thriving, dynamic society, country, and people that in the end can pursue their objectives and fulfill their dreams.
Maybe just to finish off, because we are sitting here in between people and their drinks.
Yes.
Based on all your vast experience advising governments, international organizations, are you hopeful that these trapped regions their potential can be unleashed? Do you believe that this can really happen, or are we all doomed?
All right, this is an interesting question, because I've been talking about the rise of anti-system voting, economic decline, and the consequences of economic decline for the best of 20 years. My discourse has caught a lot of attention in the last 10 years, especially since the Brexit vote, the first election of Donald Trump. And you accused me of being pessimistic at the beginning. I will hold no grudge against you. But in the 10 years I've been talking about this, not in my wildest dreams, I would have imagined that we would be in this situation. The situation is worse than what I was saying it was. So the situation is difficult. But am I hopeful? Yes. Because we can change the situation. We can, if we do the things that are right, if we have the right strategies, if we help mobilize potential, this is where we can make a difference. But the difference is not going to come by having a top-down solution and an agreement between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. It's not going to come, certainly not, from having an agreement between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. It's going to come from all of us, from making sure that we can fulfill our potential and we can actually play to the best of our talents. But that cannot be done by individuals on their own. This is where all the intermediaries, from your microfinance institutions, to your banks, to your universities, to your, let's say, teachers, to your hospitals, to your courts, to the police, to all the organizations and the way we structure everything, work together in the same direction. And it can be done. There are plenty of examples across the world of places where the quality of life has improved. Just to give you an idea, over the last quarter of a century, more people in the world have escaped out of poverty than in the whole history of humanity before. The only problem is that most of those people are in Asia. It's good for them. It's a fantastic, but it's not that they're not elsewhere. Fundamentally in China, in Southeast Asia, and along the Silk Route, including places like Kazakhstan. For many other parts of the world, that's not the case. In many parts of Africa, 650 million in Africa, in Latin America, fundamentally live in places that are poorer than they were a quarter of a century ago. There are many places in the world that show that this can be done with the right. Let's try to follow by example, adapt our policies to what's happening everywhere, and make sure that wherever there's talent, wherever there's potential that is untapped, we put all the tools in place so that it works, and then we can have a much better and a brighter future for not just the few, but for all.
Thank you, Andrés. I think we can finish with this hopeful message. The key takeaways are that the situation is difficult. The mega trends are shaping that situation in a ways that cannot necessarily always be forecasted or predicted with precision. But we have a role to play, and we have a lot of opportunities to use to make as much as possible of these challenges going forward, and we hope to spend these 2 days discussing the ways of making that happen. And I think this is a great inspiration and a great diagnostic that will help us move forward with our discussions going forward. And the places that don't matter, that you call places that don't matter, matter for us. So thank you very much.